Welcome to episode 8 of Behind the Bills. I'm Iván Carrillo. Coming up, we're 3 weeks into 2025, and we've had no shortage of policy news. Front and center is the second inauguration of President Donald Trump. We'll break down the executive orders he signed around immigration and LGBTQ plus rights and how it impacts California public schools. Plus, a wide-ranging conversation with Senator John Laird. What does a second Trump term mean for the California legislature? And what does he think about the state of Proposition 98? All of that and much more here on Behind the Bills. So let's jump right in. On Monday, Donald Trump was sworn in as the 47th president of the United States, and he wasted no time implementing policies that he campaigned on. There were a whole host of executive orders that were signed into action on day one. One of his early actions was to rescind policy that protected schools from immigration enforcement and treated them as sensitive locations. This action goes against everything that we stand for as an organization, as we recognize the importance for all California students to have access to a safe, secure, and supportive learning environment. A learning environment where they don't have to live in fear of something terrible happening to them or their families. We know from experience the impact that this will have on our school communities. This is already playing out. We know students will not show up to school. We know families will disengage. We know learning will be disrupted. We know bullying will increase. We know that there will be impacts on mental health and students' social emotional well-being. I wish I could tell you that I have all the answers, but I don't. We're working day and night with legal counsel, with the governor's office, with the attorney general's office to do everything in our power to keep schools and students and families safe. Everything we're hearing so far is a recommendation that schools utilize the guidance that was outlined and released by our attorney general in recent weeks. The guidance speaks to the fact that schools have the ability to limit disruption, to request and verify identification of any immigration enforcement, and furthermore request a warrant before providing entry onto school campus. I recognize that there's still a whole host of questions that need answering and legal clarity provided. We will continue to work here diligently to answer those questions and provide that information. Lastly, on this topic, I want to point to our ACSA resource hub, where we have a landing page that has a many resources for you, for your staff, and for your families to make sure that school communities have the information that they need to best protect themselves. So please review those resources. Please share them broadly, and we'll continue to update that landing page as more resources become available. One of the other early actions we saw from President Trump was the signing of an executive order that requires all federal agencies to only recognize two sexes, male and female. As we begin to dig into the particulars of the executive order, we see the potential implications as it touches on things such as guidance that's provided to schools, as well as anti-discrimination protections for some of our most marginalized community members. And this effort certainly can't be seen in isolation. It's part of a broader effort at the federal level to come after members of the LGBTQ plus community. These efforts are all interconnected, and it requires us here within ACSA, but here within California, more broadly speaking, to make sure that we're doing everything in our power to protect and serve LGBTQ plus community members. When LGBTQ plus students do not feel safe, we know that it has impact on academic outcomes. We know that it has impact on rates of bullying. And most heartbreaking are the impacts on mental health, especially when we've seen data come out from the CDC, which shows that more than 40% of LGBTQ plus youth have considered suicide. And ultimately, we fear that executive orders like these will increase these rates even higher. So it's incumbent on all of us to make sure that we're doing everything in our power to make sure that we're fighting back against these types of attacks, and that we're doing everything possible to make sure that schools are places where LGBTQ plus youth, undocumented, mixed status families, and all other marginalized communities feel safe, seen, and secure. I'm excited to introduce our next guest. He's no stranger to ACSA, longtime friend of our association, longtime champion of public education, Senator John Laird. Thank you so much for joining us here today.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Senator, we're in the first week of the new Trump administration, so I want to start there. We're already seeing a whole host of activity, executive orders that have come out. How is what we're seeing at the federal level influencing the legislative session and what's to come?
As we speak, we will be having a budget hearing today, and we will be looking at a package of issues. And we're really dwelling right out the gate on the legal issues and empowering the Attorney General and others to represent California's legal position. And if you look at what has happened in the first hours of the administration, it's been an excessive number of executive orders, and some of them, like the one on birthright citizenship, just seems unconstitutional out the gate. So immediately it is, who litigates this? How do you litigate this? And so we're still trying to judge just what the authority is here and trying to fight back. But as always in the education world, people look at sort of schools on the ground or education budgets on the ground, but it's everything that impacts that. If kids' health care are impacted, it impacts schools. If their immigration status is questioned, it impacts schools. If what's allowed to go next to the schools is questioned, then that impacts the schools. And so we're trying to look at all the different things that are coming out of this. And I think it's just almost like this blitz of executive orders, and we're still working on what it means.
Yeah, one of those areas that we know has impact on student outcomes and well-being is making sure that schools are safe, inclusive learning environments for all students. And part of the executive orders that we've already seen come out, not to mention just the broader rhetoric, is certainly an attack on the LGBTQ plus community. You're a longtime member and leader within the LGBTQ plus legislative caucus. It was just a short time ago that the new legislature was sworn in, and rightfully so. We're celebrating the fact that we're at a historic high in terms of number of members of the LGBTQ plus legislative caucus. So we have this dichotomy that's playing out here within California, what we're seeing come from Washington, D.C. How do you view this? What types of conversations are being had in terms of the state's ability to protect and support LGBTQ plus youth?
Well, it's interesting because as we tape this, one of my preceding appointments this morning was with an LGBTQ middle school student from my district who came with their mother and some people in the Capitol out of concern that they were just under threat. And there was big concern. And the primary thing was, what are you going to do? And I was able to go through the fact that we're ready to draw the line. We're ready to fight. We're already considering legislation that does things that, if there's certain things that publicly name trans people in terms of registries, that those are confidential, and in a way to try to protect against what might threaten people's safety out of these actions that come out of Washington. As with everything, we're still trying to determine the impact and what's trying to be done. But we know that we're going to fight, and we know that we're going to try to protect kids in the midst of this. And we're just trying to figure out the most appropriate way, given just what's transpired in the last couple of days.
And Senator, I know I'm asking you about things that are happening in real time, right? And things that just are coming out as we speak. And another area of just particular emphasis and concern of all of ours, I know, is the rollback of treating schools as sensitive locations where there can't be immigration enforcement. We're already hearing reports from different parts of the state about how the impacts that that's having in terms of the fear, folks not showing up to work, but folks not showing up to school, kids, right? The learning loss that's already starting, the impacts on mental health. But any insight you can provide in terms of the conversations being had related to immigrant communities?
Well, the bills are being introduced, but we're really trying to fight this out also in the legal realm. And as you said, in sort of stating the situation, I mean, I represent a rural district with significant pockets of agriculture, and I've never understood how we're going to continue agricultural production if there's any kind of mass deportations. It just makes no sense whatsoever. And ironically, there are a lot of people in the ag industry that were supporters of the new president. And I am hoping that they will have an impact in able to push back on this. I worked hard when I was in the assembly before President Obama was president for universal health care coverage for kids. And when I was doing that, I took the revolutionary step at the time of including kids regardless of their immigration status. And one of the reasons is that, and this is before the pandemic, if an epidemic moves through school, it doesn't stop at deaths of kids that are legally documented and pass up the deaths of those that aren't. It's a public health issue across the board, and we have to address it as a universal public health issue. And so we will fight back with that level of rationality. And we have families that are hybrid families, where there are some with legal status and some with questionable legal status, and it puts it in a really hard position. The kids might be legal, but the parents not. And the kids are entitled not to be deported, but the parents might be, and it's raising the issue all over again of family separation. And so we really want to take this out of the ideological realm and move this to the practical realm of how do you really deal with these issues with a sense of fairness. This one in particular is going to be a tough slog because of how emotional it is, but we have to do it. We just have to do it.
Senator, you are the chair of the Senate Budget Committee, a subcommittee on education finance. You just cited the fact that you're in a really unique position, given that you were served in the legislature in the early 2000s. You've been through many of these budget cycles. The context of the LA wildfires, in terms of a need to be deservedly so, right? In terms of how can the state support and help with the devastation that's taking place down there. How is that, in your mind, changing the approach to the budget cycle itself?
Well, I know your listeners are very sophisticated, but let me just stand back briefly and talk about where we are in the budget process and what that means for the question you just asked, because the governor proposed his budget roughly 10 days ago. And it in many ways is throwing things against the wall because you don't know what the revenues will really be. And so it's a blueprint, but it's not real till May. But we will be having hearings on it and the subjects in it starting in late February and going through mid-May. And in doing it, we have to look at the individual issues, which I'm sure we'll talk about some of them. Since the governor proposed a budget, the presidency changed. And there will be all these revenue things that might change to the budget that we haven't anticipated in the final document that the governor presented 10 days ago. And then we had the fires, as you call out, and there's so many different impacts with that. I have personal experience in different ways in a fire that took over 900 homes in my district in 2020. And there's one rural school district where 27% of the student body lived in a house that burned down. And so then when you're looking at that, fortunately, we had the rolling attendance things going on at the time so that they could rely on their previous year's attendance so that there wasn't a cliff that people went over. Now we're having Los Angeles, and I think the thing here is that it's going to hit the budget on both ends. On the revenue end, it will really hit in that there is no revenue from the business communities that burned, and the property tax revenue will probably be challenged. And then if you look at the spending side, the governor's talking about certain guarantees about kids and them being admitted to other schools, but do they get ADA for them admitted? Some of them might be basic aid, which is a really unique thing. There's the bizarre circumstance where some kids might have not been actual residents of a district and attending as either an interdistrict transfer or doing something remote, and so their house didn't burn down. The schools are still there in the district they reside in, but they could be entitled to placement and all this other stuff, even though that was the circumstance. So we're really early on in this. The fires have barely been put out, and we're going to have some tough questions about enrollment for certain districts, about the facilities that burnt down, and the count I heard is that there's 17 schools that either completely burned down or were partially damaged. And so there's real issues about what to do with those schools and replacements, what to do with the students until they're replaced. And many of the students lived in burnt out houses. This is still an unsettled situation with many different challenges, but we are really committed to work on them with the local school districts and the local students and families, try to the minimum displacement that is possible and how this comes down.
I wanted to shift to Proposition 98. You're seeing the governor propose an underfunding of Proposition 98 and justifying this. The rationale being provided is because of economic uncertainty. What's your response to this approach from the governor?
I'm still trying to understand how you can estimate revenues at a certain level and not have Proposition 98 match the level of revenues that are estimated. That would be one of the first things we ask when we go into the overview hearing, which will probably be our first one at the end of next month. We need to see where the revenues actually are. They won't be clear for sure until May. We have to make sure that Proposition 98 matches where the revenues are, and that will be a goal. And I think one of the things that happened last year when there was a real, let's just say, kerfuffle on Proposition 98 was the governor's proposal was to shift a lot of the costs to the general fund. And that is concerning. It was concerning last year. School officials, your members, were cheering at the fact that they were going to be held harmless in the dip in revenues. And the general fund in the out years was going to pick up the difference. But if it were tight budgets, it's going to cut child care for kids and families. It's going to cut health care for kids. It could cut any of a number of services that go to kids. And so it's robbing Peter to pay Paul. So you always have to be concerned that we are in fact sticking to what's constitutional with the education funding, but recognizing that there's a correlation with the general fund, and a lot of services for young people are included in the general fund. And our goal, of course, is to make sure it is all held whole and it is all held harmless. And so obviously we want to do what's constitutional, make sure the revenues that are actually in the budget match what's in Prop 98. But we want to make sure it's not done at the expense of childcare and health care and other things. And that is really, really hard. Sometimes it's a fixed pie and you have to make tough choices. But I'm just surprised that there's an issue with Prop 98 after last year. I would think the last thing you'd want to do is pick a fight with educational stakeholders over Prop 98.
With respects to just Prop 98 broadly, what are some priorities of yours entering this budget negotiation cycle?
It's interesting because despite what we said about sort of the base level and how that gets set and where that is in the budget, it's roughly a 2.5% increase that the governor has proposed. And given the budget stuff, that's probably good. If you have labor contracts or inflation, that's going to be a struggle to keep up with that in the districts. And the thing that always frustrates schools districts is that there's certain money that you know is going to be solid over time, and so you try to put what isn't solid over time into one-time expenditures to be able to help school districts so they get more than the COLA, but they don't get it in a way that they can count on it after the budget year, and that completely makes school budget people crazy. And yet it would be crazier if we put every dollar we had into ongoing expenditures and then the next year said, okay, you have to take 1.5% cut. I think what we'd try to do is get as much as we could to the districts in the ongoing COLA that is fiscally responsible, and then in the one-time money, help districts address some of the most pressing issues, such as teacher retention and teacher recruitment, and some of the things that are really hitting school districts across the board, across the state.
Any words you would impart on school leaders up and down the state who are navigating these really difficult, challenging times, this hyper politicized environment, concerned about just policies that are unfolding, that are putting marginalized communities at risk?
Well, first, let me say that everybody across the state is doing God's work here, and you are really, serving kids in a way, trying to manage all these things that is really important to everyone in California. And as I sort of say every time I talk to you, my father was an ACSA member, and my father was a teacher, and then eventually an administrator. And one of the great things that happens to me is, I think 3 times since I've been in Sacramento, somebody has walked up to me and said, my father changed their life. And I know he probably could have made a lot of money doing something else, but that's what he chose to do. And so I want to recognize that level of service, but I also want to recognize that it's stories like that in the lobbying process make the difference. If people just wring their hands and talk about funding, it's not helpful. But if they wring their hands and say, here's a kid that is not getting an expanded learning opportunity, and here's his or her story, and tells that story, that is the powerful thing in what we're about to do. And so I just thank everybody for their work and look forward to hearing stories of what the practical impacts are that might be even told by the students themselves in a way that it will move legislators, and it will help me in my job and with the goals I've outlined in this podcast.
Thank you so much just for your leadership, for your advocacy, and appreciate you being a guest on Behind the Bills. Look forward to being in touch throughout this budget process.
And thank you for having me. And I know that we're so early in the process of both the new administration and the budget that some of the things we talked about were speculation. And I know you're going to call and say, okay, we have the specifics, come talk to people. So I will be ready when that happens. And I know I will be seeing a lot of you in my office. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. That's it for this episode of Behind the Bills. As always, be sure to like, review, and subscribe. And now we're excited to announce a $200 Amazon gift card for our subscribers. All you need to do is send a screenshot of your rating and review to behindthebills@ACSA.org. We'll announce a winner when we hit 500 subscribers. You must be an ACSA member to participate. This podcast was produced by Michael Kelly. For everyone here at ACSA, I'm Iván Carrillo. We'll see you next time.